I'm a 32-year-old woman. And the morning I found out I was locked out of my inheritance started like any other. Until my phone buzzed with a voicemail that made my stomach drop. Because when the bank manager said my name and then paused like he was bracing himself, I knew something was wrong. And as I sat on the edge of my unmade bed in my tiny apartment, still wearing yesterday's clothes from a double shift, I listened as he calmly explained that the trust account I'd been told would take care of everything was no longer accessible to me. And in that moment my chest tightened so hard it felt personal, like betrayal with a pulse. Because my father had died 6 months earlier, and every decision I'd made since then, every sleepless night, every bill I'd paid late, had been with the quiet belief that he had planned for me the way he always promised he would. Except now I was being told, in the most professional tone imaginable, that my access had been revoked due to a recent amendment I'd never heard of, signed weeks before his death. And as I replayed those words, I could see my aunt's tight smile at the funeral. The way my cousin avoided my eyes, the way everyone told me to be patient when I asked about paperwork, and suddenly patience felt like a weapon they'd used to keep me calm while something was taken from me. Because I wasn't reckless or entitled. I was practical. I'd grown up learning how to stretch a dollar, how to stay quiet during adult arguments, how to survive without asking for much. And that inheritance wasn't about luxury, it was about stability, about finally breathing without counting pennies, about honoring my father's voice in my head telling me I'd be okay. And as I stood up and paced my living room, the anger crept in behind the fear, sharp and focused, because someone had decided I didn't deserve what was meant for me, and worse, they thought I wouldn't fight back. And that's when the memories started lining up like evidence, the sudden insistence that I sign routine documents the way my aunt offered to handle things while I was grieving, the subtle comments about how my father had been worried about me, and I realized this wasn't a mistake or a misunderstanding, it was a move, a calculated one. And I was the only person in the room who hadn't known the game was being played. And when I finally called the number back and asked the bank manager who now controlled the trust, there was another pause, heavier this time, before he said a name I knew far too well. And as that name echoed through my apartment, I understood that the inheritance wasn't just gone, it was sitting in the hands of someone who had smiled at me through my grief. And right then, with my phone pressed to my ear and my heart pounding like a warning, I realized the real story wasn't about money at all. It was about how far my own family was willing to go to erase me. And the question burning in my mind wasn't whether I'd get my inheritance back, but what I'd uncover if I tried. Looking back, the signs had always been there, woven quietly into my relationships, like loose threads I never thought to pull. Because my family had mastered the art of sounding supportive while keeping score. And growing up I learned early that love often came with conditions no one said out loud, especially when it came to my Aunt Marlene, who stepped into our lives after my mom died and acted like a second parent while constantly reminding me how much she'd sacrificed, even though my father was the one paying most of the bills. And my cousin Daniel, her son, was treated like the golden child, the one everyone assumed would go far, while I was seen as the practical one, the dependable one, the one who would be fine no matter what. And that label followed me into adulthood, where I became the person people leaned on but rarely protected. Even at work, where I held a steady administrative role at a small logistics firm, and watched younger, louder colleagues get promoted because they knew how to sell themselves better than I did. And maybe that's part of why I didn't question things when my aunt offered to help manage my father's affairs after his diagnosis. Because grief makes you tired and trust feels easier than suspicion. And my friends, well-meaning as they were, kept telling me family wouldn't do something like that. That money changes people but not blood. Except I'd seen how resentment can live quietly for years. Like the way Marlene would casually mention how my father always favored me, or how Daniel would joke about me being set for life while I was still budgeting groceries. And I realize now those comments weren't jokes, they were measurements. And the more I replay conversations in my head, the more I remember moments that didn't sit right. Like how my aunt insisted my father update his estate plan, just in case, or how she discouraged me from being present at meetings because I was too emotional. And maybe I was, but that emotion came from love, not greed. And yet somehow I was painted as the unstable one while decisions were made without me. And even my father, strong and stubborn as he was, grew quieter near the end, deferring to Marlene more often, trusting her confidence when his own strength was fading. And that's the part that hurts the most, wondering whether he truly wanted things this way, or whether he was guided there by someone who knew exactly how to frame concern as control. And as I think about the people in my life now, the coworkers who ask polite questions, the friends who want updates, the family members who suddenly stopped checking in, I can feel the lines shifting, alliances forming before I even speak. Because conflict has a way of revealing who benefits from silence. And while no one has openly accused me of anything yet, there's a tension in the air like they waiting to see whether I accept what happened or make it uncomfortable for everyone else. And deep down I know that if I push forward, I won't just be challenging a legal decision, I'll be challenging the version of me they've all quietly agreed on, the easy one, the compliant one, the one who doesn't rock the boat, and the unsettling thought that keeps me up at night, just whether I can handle the fight ahead. But whether uncovering the truth will cost me the last pieces of family I thought I still had. The first real turning point came a week later when I finally sat across from a lawyer in a glass-walled office that smelled like polished wood and quiet authority, and as he flipped through the documents I'd brought, my confidence drained with every page he read in silence. Because there it was, in black and white, a trust amendment signed by my father just 3 weeks before he died, giving my aunt full control until certain conditions were met, conditions so vague they felt intentionally slippery. And my chest tightened as the lawyer carefully explained that challenging it would be expensive, time-consuming, and emotionally draining. And that was before he even mentioned the possibility that my aunt could legally freeze the remaining assets if she felt threatened. And suddenly, the room felt smaller because this wasn't just about proving something was wrong, it was about deciding whether I was willing to risk losing everything for the chance to reclaim what should have been mine. And as I walked out into the street, afterward my phone lit up with a message from my cousin Daniel asking if I was doing okay, and reminding me that his mom was just trying to keep things fair. And that word fair hit me like an insult because fairness hadn't been part of the process at all, not when I was excluded from meetings, not when decisions were made while I was grieving, not when control was quietly transferred behind my back, and yet here I was being asked, gently but firmly, to accept it, to stay calm, to trust the system that had already failed me. And the pressure started coming from every direction. My boss hinting that I seemed distracted lately and needed to stay focused if I wanted to keep my job. My friends warning me that legal fights tear families apart, my aunt herself calling that evening with a voice so sweet it almost fooled me, telling me she loved me, that my father had been worried about my financial responsibility, that this arrangement was for my own good. And I remember staring at the wall while she spoke, feeling something shift inside me because part of me wanted to believe her, wanted the pain to stop, wanted to choose peace over conflict, but another part of me, quieter but steadier, knew that accepting her explanation meant accepting a version of myself that was powerless and incapable. And the doubt gnawed at me. What if I was wrong? What if fighting made me look exactly like the greedy person they were already painting me as? What if this was my father's choice and I was disrespecting it? But then I remembered the promises he made, the conversations we had, the way he used to say he trusted me more than anyone. And the fear turned into resolve so sharp it scared me, because I realized the real dilemma wasn't whether I could win. It was whether I could live with myself if I didn't try. And as I lay awake that night, replaying every warning, every threat wrapped in concern, I understood that the moment I took my next step, whether it was forward or back, would change how my family saw me forever. And with a single unanswered email from the lawyer glowing on my phone, asking if I wanted to proceed, the weight of that decision pressed down on me, heavy and irreversible, leaving me suspended between silence and confrontation, knowing that whatever I chose next would ignite something I wouldn't be able to control. Once I decided not to walk away, everything sped up in ways I wasn't prepared for. Because my aunt seemed to sense the shift before I ever said a word, and suddenly my access to information tightened. Calls went unanswered, documents I requested were misplaced, and when I politely asked for basic financial statements, I received a carefully worded email suggesting that any further inquiries should go through her attorney, which felt less like a boundary and more like a warning. And almost immediately, the consequences started stacking up. My bank flagged unusual delays on bills I'd always paid on time. My credit card balance crept higher because the safety net I was counting on was frozen, and at work, my performance review was abruptly rescheduled with a vague comment about concerns, as if my personal life had quietly followed me into the office. And then the rumors began, subtle at first, family friends calling to ask if I was doing all right in that tone people use when they've already been told a story about you. And I realized my aunt was controlling more than money. She was shaping the narrative, presenting herself as the responsible protector, and me as the unstable beneficiary who couldn't be trusted with her own future. And the ethical dilemma hit harder than I expected, because every move I made felt like it confirmed their version of events. If I pushed too hard, I looked desperate. If I stayed quiet, I looked guilty. And when my cousin Daniel showed up unannounced one evening, leaning against my doorway like this was a casual visit, his words were friendly but his message wasn't. telling me his mom was stressed that legal action would force her hand, that family issues should stay in the family. And for a moment, I wondered if I was tearing something apart that could never be repaired, but then he casually mentioned how expensive court battles were and how quickly savings disappear, and the implication was clear. They were betting I'd break first, and I could feel the pressure closing in from every angle. The fear of losing my job, the fear of being cut off completely, the fear that fighting back would leave me isolated and broke. Yet backing down felt like signing away my own voice. And when I finally received a formal letter from my aunt's lawyer outlining restrictions on my involvement and suggesting mediation under terms I had agreed to, my hands shook as I read it, because this wasn't defensive anymore. It was strategic. And I started questioning everything. Whether my father truly understood what he signed. Whether I'd underestimated how far my aunt would go. Whether the cost of this fight would outweigh whatever was left to recover. And that night, as I sat alone, surrounded by unopened mail and overdue notices, I opened an old folder of my father's emails, searching for reassurance. For proof, for something solid, and I found one message I'd overlooked before, short and unfinished, sent days before his health declined sharply, mentioning a meeting he was confused about and asking me to double-check everything. And as I stared at those words, my pulse racing, I realized this wasn't just escalation anymore, it was a countdown. Because whatever really happened back then was still buried, and someone was doing everything they could to make sure I never uncovered it. The twist didn't come from a courtroom or a confrontation. It came quietly, almost accidentally, when I finally convinced my father's old accountant to meet me for coffee. And as he stirred his drink with nervous hands, he told me there was something that had been bothering him for months, because the timeline never quite made sense. And when he explained that the trust amendment everyone kept pointing to hadn't been initiated by my father at all. It had been requested by my aunt, justified as a temporary safeguard while my dad was confused, and my breath caught as he admitted that my father had questioned the changes during their last meeting, saying he didn't remember agreeing to certain conditions, asking why access was being delayed, and then canceling a follow-up appointment days later when his health took a sudden turn. And I remember sitting there frozen, the noise of the cafe fading as the weight of that realization settled in, because all those moments I'd replayed in my head. The hesitation, the silence, the way my father looked uncertain but trusting, suddenly snapped into focus, and the betrayal felt deeper than I'd imagined. Not just financial but personal, because this wasn't a misunderstanding or a protective measure. It was someone stepping in while he was vulnerable and steering the outcome. And when the accountant slid a copy of an email across the table, showing my aunt pushing for urgency, citing concerns about me that sounded rehearsed and exaggerated, my hands started to shake. Not just from anger but from the clarity of it all. The way she'd framed herself as the responsible one. The way she'd planted doubt about my stability. The way she'd isolated me just enough to control the story. And for a moment I felt sick. Wondering how long this plan had been forming and how carefully it had been executed. And yet even with that evidence sitting between us, the situation didn't suddenly become simple. Because the accountant warned me that proving undue influence is difficult, that timing and intent are slippery things in court, and that pushing forward would mean exposing family secrets my aunt would fight viciously to protect. And as I drove home afterward, my shock slowly transformed into something steadier, more dangerous, because now I wasn't just reacting. I understood the game, and every kind word my aunt had spoken, every warning wrapped in concern, every attempt to paint me as incapable, felt like part of a larger strategy I'd underestimated. And when I checked my phone that evening, there was a voicemail from her, calm but firm, saying she'd heard I was asking questions and reminding me that dragging things out would only hurt everyone involved. And that's when the final piece clicked. Because if she was so confident she'd done nothing wrong, she wouldn't be afraid of questions. And standing there in my apartment, replaying my father's unfinished email in my mind, I felt the shock give way to resolve, knowing that the truth had shifted everything, but also knowing that revealing it would come at a cost I hadn't fully measured yet. Because uncovering how this really happened wouldn't just challenge my aunt's control, it would force everyone to confront a version of events they were comfortable ignoring. And as I saved the accountant's email to multiple folders and locked my phone, I understood that the inheritance was no longer the biggest secret in this story, and that what I'd just learned was powerful enough to change the outcome, if I was brave enough to use it. The decision came on a quiet morning when the weight of everything finally settled into something I could understand. Because I realized waiting was no longer neutral, it was a choice in itself. And it was costing me more each day, so I sat at my kitchen table with my laptop open, my father's email printed beside me, and the accountant's message saved and backed up. and I made the call I'd been avoiding, telling the lawyer I wanted to proceed, fully aware that this meant crossing a line I could never uncross, and almost immediately the consequences followed. My aunt stopped calling entirely, replacing her warmth with silence so loud it felt intentional. My cousin sent a long message accusing me of betrayal and selfishness, saying I was tearing the family apart for money, and even though I expected it, reading those words still hurt, because I wasn't fighting for greed, I was fighting for truth. Yet I also felt a strange sense of relief, like I'd finally stopped holding my breath. And financially things got harder before they got better. Legal fees began draining what little savings I had. I picked up extra hours at work and swallowed my pride when my boss warned me that my personal issues couldn't affect my performance, but emotionally something shifted because for the first time since my father died, I felt aligned with myself, even when doubt crept in late at night, whispering that maybe peace would have been easier. Maybe silence would have been safer, but then there were small moments that reminded me why I chose this path, like rereading my father's words asking me to double-check everything, or realizing that by pushing back, I was honoring his trust in me, not defying it. And when the formal challenge was filed, and my aunt's lawyer responded with sharp language and thinly veiled threats, I didn't panic the way I once would have, because I understood now that fear was part of the leverage, and even though relationships fractured, some unexpectedly strengthened. A close friend offered support without judgment, a coworker quietly shared that she'd been through something similar. And those connections reminded me that standing up for myself didn't mean standing alone. And while the outcome of the case remained uncertain, I accepted that realism mattered more than fantasy. This wasn't going to end with everyone apologizing and hugging it out. It was going to end with boundaries drawn, truths exposed, and a version of my family forever changed. And I made peace with that, because protecting my moral ground mattered more than preserving a fragile harmony built on silence. And as I signed the final documents authorizing my lawyer to move forward, my hands steady despite everything at stake, I felt both the loss and the strength of that choice. Knowing I might lose relationships, money, or even the inheritance itself, but I would not lose myself, and that understanding, heavy and hard-earned, became the anchor I held onto as the process moved ahead. Because no matter how this ended, I had chosen to confront what was wrong instead of accepting what was convenient. And for the first time in a long while, that felt like the right kind of inheritance to claim. Now that everything has settled and the dust has finally cleared, I find myself thinking less about the money, and more about what this experience taught me about trust and boundaries. Because the inheritance, while important, turned out to be a symbol of something deeper. The belief that the people closest to you will protect your interests when you're most vulnerable. And learning that this isn't always true was painful but clarifying. Since the legal process eventually confirmed what I already knew in my gut, that the amendment had been improperly influenced and parts of it were reversed, giving me access to what my father originally intended, though not without cost, because by the time it ended, my relationship with my aunt was fractured beyond repair. My cousin barely speaks to me, and family gatherings are quieter now, more cautious, but there's a strange peace in that honesty, because I'm no longer pretending things are fine just to keep the surface smooth. And I've learned that responsibility doesn't always look like compromise. Sometimes it looks like standing alone while everyone else insists you're wrong. And I used to think setting boundaries meant pushing people away, but now I understand it means protecting the parts of yourself that matter, even when it's uncomfortable. And while I wish my father hadn't been caught in the middle of this, I also believe honoring him meant questioning what didn't feel right. Not blindly accepting explanations that erased my role in his life. And the experience forced me to grow in ways I didn't ask for, to speak up when my voice shook, to accept temporary instability in exchange for long-term self-respect, and to let go of the idea that family harmony is always worth the sacrifice. Because sometimes harmony is just silence dressed up as peace. And looking back, I don't regret the choice I made, even on the hardest days, because I know I acted with integrity, not impulse, and I didn't let fear decide for me. And if there's one thing I carry forward, it's the understanding that trust should never require you to disappear. And responsibility doesn't mean surrendering your agency to make others comfortable. And I wonder, honestly, if you were in my place, grieving, pressured, and quietly pushed aside, would you have stayed silent to keep the peace? Or would you have risked everything to protect what you knew was rightfully yours? Because sometimes the most important inheritance isn't money or property, it's the moment you choose yourself. And that choice, once made, changes how you move through the world forever.